So I want to thank my co-presenters, the University of Arizona College of Engineering. I want to thank the SME and the chairs for allowing me to present today our topic on lunar mining, pitfalls in health and safety. The objective of today's presentation is going to be to review health and safety pitfalls or issues in extracting resources from the moon by future commercial lunar miners. The agenda is going to be fairly aggressive. We're going to be covering such things as a mining scenario to set the stage for the whole talk. I'm going to go over a flight profile, what it takes to go from Earth to the moon, some issues about health in transit, and then a fair number of issues about the surface of the moon. If there's one takeaway message today, it's going to be about lunar dust and lessons we learned from Apollo. So if you get a chance, I would really focus on that particular one. So here's our scenario. Imagine a permanent mining base on the moon. It's a multi-month surface rotation because it's too expensive just to go back and forth every week. Probably 4 more lunar miners. Humans will be there as a supporting role. We'll be supporting autonomous vehicles and equipment that will be extracting and processing ore. This presentation today is going to cover the goals of health. Tomorrow in this room at 2 o'clock, I'll be discussing the realities of actually mechanically mining ores and minerals on the moon tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So from Earth to the moon is a 3-day journey, 240,000 miles approximately, depends on the year that you go. The main thing here but today to talk about is that the entire time that you're flying to the moon, you're weightless. There is discussions about having an intermediate step in the future called gateway around the moon. If that takes place, that will add to the time. The key thing from this particular slide, the takeaway message is weightlessness. So a few things to talk about in transit. The first one is the scariest one. There's a catastrophic risk with any rocket that you can go up into. There are a number of vehicles that can actually transport humans to the moon. Ironically, none of them have carried humans yet, but they're soon to carry humans. If you look at the bottom right at the bottom, the space shuttle, which is from the 70s, had a predicted catastrophic rate of 0.35%. When it actually launched through its entire career, there were 2 major catastrophes. Its catastrophic rate was 1.48%. So there is risk when you fly in a rocket. Space motion sickness is not the kind of sickness that you would get from going on a carnival ride. It's not the same thing. It probably comes from conflict with your inner ear. The thing is, about 80% of the astronauts who go up in space experience this. The good news, it goes away after about 1 or 2 days in space. Interestingly enough, when you return to Earth, you reinstitute gravity to your body, space motion sickness can come back. That could be a problem going to the moon upon landing on the moon. So the treatment for this is anti-nausea medications, but these also have side effects. A somewhat related topic has to do with cardiovascular deconditioning. When you go from Earth into space, into zero gravity, the fluid shifts from your body, the bottom part of your body up to your head. Your face becomes puffy, your taste is off, and you urinate out about 1 or 2 liters of fluid, and that's your new steady state for fluids. When you go from zero gravity back to gravity, fluid goes back to your lower body, your heart rate goes up, you can become lightheaded, and that could potentially affect landing on the moon, just like it could affect landing on the Earth. To reduce the risk of this, people drink saline types of fluids. They could wear a positive pressure lower torso suit or sit in a recumbent seat. Now let's shift gears to the moon itself. To set the stage, let's talk about the environment. Most of you would know that the sunlight at the bulk of the moon is about 2 weeks on and 2 weeks of daytime and then 2 weeks of nighttime. The gravity is about 1/6 that of Earth. The atmosphere is a near vacuum. Temperature swings by more than 550 degrees. Yes, there's frozen liquid that more than likely came from comets, and not just at the poles, but probably everywhere buried in the regolith. The moon is radiation vulnerable, which I will discuss in a couple of slides. And the big thing we'll be talking about today is dust. This slide talks about radiation. So on Earth, we have the magnetic field in the atmosphere which shields us from radiation. Those things don't exist on the moon. The first thing to be aware about is galactic cosmic radiation, which is coming from deep space. Its intensity is low and constant. It's high energy protons, and it slowly over time can cause problems with the human body, such as causing cataracts and certain types of cancer. Sort of opposite of that is the solar particle events, which comes from the sun. This is high and episodic with high energy protons. You can get acute radiation syndrome and die from this if you're exposed. We now know that there's a combination of galactic cosmic radiation and solar particle events that react with the regolith. It causes some form of low intensity energy. No one knows about whether this will lead to any organ damage, but I would suspect this would be minimal. And solar polar events, SPEs, these are an 11-year solar cycle. The frequency goes up and down, and the intensity ranges dramatically. The solar polar events that are really, really high can kill you in a matter of a few days. The teaching knowledge about this is with a solar particle event, if you're on the moon, you probably have about 30 minutes to seek shelter at the present moment. I want to bring up a recent lander that was from China that took place in 2019. So China landed Chang 4, and the reason to bring this up is they had a pretty cool item on the surface with the rover, or with the lander. It was the Lander Neutrons and Dosimetry, or LND unit. During this period of time, there was no major solar particle events. It mainly measured background radiation. They found about 75% of the radiation they measured was from galactic cosmic radiation, and 25% was from the surface. What does this mean practically? This radiation exposure is about twice what you'd see on the International Space Station, about 200 times more than you'd see on Earth. But ultimately what this means is it tells you the calculation how long you could be on the moon. So if you're a future lunar miner, you have about 700 days on the surface of the moon before you'd reach your dosimetry limit. That's assuming you had no unprotected SPE events. Shielding on the moon is actually fairly easy. You could always use water, aluminum, or polyethylene, but you have regolith. It's estimated that you need about 50 centimeters of shielding to shield from an SPE. If you added more regolith, you can actually probably reduce your exposure to galactic cosmic radiation. There is discussions that you could take certain types of foods or pharmaceuticals to reduce your exposure or mitigate your exposure, including seaweed, which doesn't sound too appetizing. So there's things called radioprotectors, which you could take before an exposure, radiomodulators, and radiomitigators. These are at the most speculative. A friend of mine is actually working on one of these now as a pharmaceutical physician. But for a high-powered SPE, these are unlikely to prevent death. Now, one of the key takeaway messages is lunar dust. This is not Earth dust. Gene Cernan was the last person to walk on the moon. He died in 2017. That's a picture of him in the lunar lander. If you look at his forehead, you could see dust there. You could see dust all over his shirt. But I think the message from the past is pretty poignant. Gene Cernan said, "I think we can overcome other physiological, physical, or mechanical problems except for dust." Well, how big of a deal is this stuff? There's a pretty cool video of this.
Everything's getting awful dusty. Everything is just full of dust.
Artemis 3, particles of dust that hovers above the surface. But this is not any ordinary dust, but ground up lunar rock, regolith. It will clog drills, scratch spacesuits, and tear holes in gloves. And because lunar regolith absorbs sunlight, electrostatic particles can cling to, well, everything.
So what is this stuff? Lunar dust, again, is not Earth dust. Earth has had erosion from weathering. The moon is not. This is sharp and spiculated. It's high content of silica, up to 45%. Unlike Earth, it probably has a charged component to it, and it can levitate above the ground when it's kicked up. Recently, it's been discovered that it may have some nanophase iron properties. A researcher named Bell was able to actually put regolith on the ground and attract it with a magnet. This, unlike Earth dust, is extremely abrasive and it clings to fabrics and metals. But again, who cares? Let's look at some damaging equipment. Apollo 17 was the longest mission on the surface of the moon more than 50 years ago, approximately 50 years ago. Only 22 hours on the surface of the moon. Compare that to a future lunar mining event of 3 months. In just 22 hours, the dust destroyed vacuum sample seals from core drilling. It eroded 3 layers of Harrison Schmidt's boot, which is about 12 to 15 layers. It compromised the shoulder joint movement of one of the EVA suits, and it adhered to virtually everything. The gateway into the human body is actually fairly scary. It's through the lungs. An astronaut, Harrison Schmitt, who is the only geologist to walk on the surface of the moon, called this lunar hay fever. The smaller the particles, the farther they can go. Really small ones can get into your brain. If you look at the graph on the right, a researcher named Caston took samples that were viable cell samples, exposed them to a 10-micron sample of simulated lunar dust, and at a moderate concentration, the cells that should have been 100% viable were only 5% viable. So this stuff is actually very damaging to DNA and can kill cells. It's got some somewhat similar similar products to volcanic ash or silicosis from mining, but the bottom line is this is unlike any kind of Earth dust. I would predict, unless it's mitigated, you're going to get severe respiratory symptoms requiring oxygen. Potentially, this is going to lead to emphysema and cancer. Sounds pretty scary. So people are working on items to mitigate the dust, such as electrostatic property changes, magnetic technologies, improving the abrasive properties of materials, airlock handling. The takeaway message is, unless this is mitigated, we are not going to be mining on the moon for long periods of time. Switching over to cool spacesuits, the EMU spacesuit. This is the view of the spacesuit that will go to the moon, but it'll be in white. These are mini spacesuits. They're for the most part adjustable and they fit almost all astronauts that go up. The only custom portion of this are the heated gloves. These suits are pressurized to 4.3 psi. Any lower and your body would not get enough oxygen. Any higher and these suits become unworkable. They have about a 30-minute oxygen supply for an emergency. Somewhat related topic to the spacesuits has to do with decompression sickness, which is basically identical to scuba divers. The critical thing is what's in red there. It's the rate of change of the pressure external to your body. So if you were standing right here and you were zipped up in a balloon super fast to 40,000 feet, the rate of change is going to take the nitrogen, which is in your bloodstream in liquid form, and turn it into bubbles. These bubbles can go to your brain, causing strokes. They can go to your lungs, and they can kill you. The areas of concern is areas in which there's changes in pressure. For example, the lunar habitat at 1 atmosphere at 14.7 psi, and if you go into a spacesuit at 4.3, that's where issues can take place. There's been no reported serious decompression sickness in space on the International Space Station, but bubbles have been seen on ultrasound in people's necks. More bubbles were seen in experiments with exertion on the ground. So miners on the moon are probably going to have this thing happen to them. The treatment for this is 100% oxygen and increasing pressure to try to drive the bubbles back into liquid form. These spacesuits are very expensive. They're millions of dollars. They are durable, but they can also have problems. You can get a hole in your EMU suit. The picture is a hole, microscopic or tiny hole, in one of the spacesuits from the International Space Station. This can come from a number of different things, such as mining equipment. These have multi-layers designed to withstand small holes. If you get a small hole, you're going to lose your oxygen supply, but you're not going to die. Typically, we try to put a patch on this and return to a habitat or a rover. If the hole is larger, this is going to lead to, unfortunately, frequent death or quick death. The EMU suits have had stress-related injuries on the International Space Station and in Apollo. The treatment for these injuries typically are conservative. Your wrist might become sore, your fingers become numb. Shoulder injuries astronauts have had to have shoulder surgery from this. The interesting thing when it comes to mining, imagine a miner going out 4 or 5 days a week on a lunar space station with repetitive motion. So there's going to be a very high chance that a lunar miner is going to get some type of injury. The bottom right is probably, I think, the most important prevention. More than likely, miners are going to need custom-fitted EMU suits. Walk back distance is kind of similar to what we experience if you go out walking in the desert. You want to walk 10 miles out and 10 miles back. You better bring enough water or you can't get back in time. So if you were in a spacesuit right now and you had to walk back, you could walk about 0.9 miles back, or you could walk back or go back about 3 miles if you were in a rover. Couple quick slides about now this is like medical topics, trauma. Blunt and penetrating trauma can happen whether you're mining on Earth or mining on the moon. The good news is the kinetic energy is less. It's about 1/6 due to your mass. The bad news is a suit rupture can lead to a lethal outcome. Projectiles also travel much farther. Okay. We have surgical things that could happen to you, such as your appendix could burst, you could develop gallbladder disease or colon issues, and that would have to be treated with antibiotics or surgery. I want to get to 2 slides from now. There's medical issues that can happen in space, such as toxic inhalation of off-gassing of materials, mental health issues. But I think the big take-home message from this section has to do with capabilities. Going to the moon is not going to the International Space Station. It's 3 days away. The cost is probably in the neighborhood of $4 billion. So we're going to need to develop hardware, equipment, and bring people to the moon that can actually take care of people and do simple surgical procedures or put people on a ventilator. That picture at the bottom right is a Russian physician who took out his own appendix in 1961 and had 2 mechanics help him. It's kind of related to this topic. And in conclusion, lunar mining will be using permanent bases. It's going to be more dangerous than just exploration. There's health and safety issues that we've discussed, including rocket failure and dust. Medical capabilities are going to have to be much higher than the International Space Station due to the complexity of where we're going to be and the cost of returning. And finally, we're going to need to assume that these things are going to happen and prepare for them. Thank you.